Greetings class and welcome back. This is chapter 10 video for standard cost. Now we're not going to go into this in great detail, but I do want to cover this because it's important and because you'll have to calculate these in your Excel project. So what we're talking about in this chapter are standard costs and the variances that occur from those standards. So we'll have a standard cost for a product, which will mean there will be a standard amount of material required, a standard amount of labor required, and a standard price for material, and a standard price for labor, standard hourly labor rate. So what we have is a fairly, when we mix up those possible variances, we have what develops into quickly a fairly complex possibility of variances that we could experience. So in this chapter, they're going to talk about that. Now, what is a standard? Well, if you're talking about standards, these are set mainly by people who look at the production process and decide what a standard amount of time is required in order to make a particular product. What amount of material is required, and then they also study to find out, okay, what is a standard price that we're going to have to pay for this material, and what should we expect to pay. So the standard is really, if everything is working optimally, that's what's going to happen. If you have a standard and that standard works optimally, then what you're talking about, the standard price, the standard material amount, the standard labor rate, all those things are going to be what you expect. They set standards many times by looking at past experience and having what used to be called time efficiency studies done in order to figure out, okay, what can we actually do, what level of commitment do we need in hours and material to do the work, and what prices are we going to have to pay for that. So we're going to set a standard price that we're going to pay. We're going to set a standard quantity that we're going to use. We're going to set a standard labor rate, and we're going to set a standard labor amount of time. Now, when we look at a standard price per unit, we're going to really look at, okay, this is how much material that we're going to use, and this is what the price is, or the cost. So the cost per statue is $12. This is a standard price per unit, and that's what we would expect to pay for the material going into those units. When we look at direct labor standards, we're really looking at the standard hours. How long does it take to make these things? What kind of labor hours commitment do we have in order to produce this? So a standard labor rate per hour defines what we expect to pay in labor costs and how much time that labor will take to make the product. So here we say, okay, we have a half an hour in direct labor hours, and the standard rate is going to be $22 per direct labor hour, so that we will have $11 per statue in labor costs. That's the standard that we're going to have. So when we set standards, what we're looking for is what is realistic. I said optimal earlier, and really, if you're meeting the standards, that is optimal, but it's not really the number of hours, the exact number of hours, because when you're looking for standards, you want to make them realistic and achievable. So when you're looking at those, you're going to look at the hours required to make these products, but you're going to build in some understanding that there may be some fluctuation in how quickly these are actually made. So when we look at variable manufacturing overhead standards, we're going to look at how much we're expecting to pay for variable overhead. So we're going to figure out, okay, what is the variable portion of the predetermined overhead rate? And here we have a rate of $6 per direct labor hour. So now what we know is, based on the standard hours per statute, we're going to multiply that by the standard the predetermined overhead rate of $6 per direct labor hour to get a $3 per statute variable overhead rate. So that cost then will be added into the other costs. So we have the direct materials cost of $12 per unit. This is how we come to the total standard cost. We have $12 per unit for direct materials, $11 per unit for direct labor, and those are going to make up our our standard cost. And then we add in a $3 per statue that we're going per unit we're going to add in for overhead. So we have a $12 per unit, $11 per unit in standard cost. The 12 is for the material, the 11 is for the labor, and $3 for the variable overhead. So we get a standard cost per unit after all those calculations of $26. So when we look at standards, we're going to look at it basically in two ways. We're going to look at the standard in the price, and we're going to look at the standard in the quantity. For materials, we'll look at the standard in the price and the standard in the number of hours used for direct labor. So the hourly rate and the hours used for labor. So here you see basically we have, when they're making this planned output of 2,100 statues, but they made 2,000, so they have actual direct materials cost, actual direct labor cost, and then they have actual variable manufacturing overhead. So that's what we had to start with. So when we're looking at the actual results, we just transfer those numbers that we had up there, up above in the earlier exhibit, down here. So we have 2,000 statues produced in actual results, and we show the direct materials, direct labor, and variable manufacturing overhead. And then in the spending budget, what we're going to do, if you recall, is we're going to go back to the standard budget and figure out, okay, well, how much should it cost for us to go from 2,100 statues down to 2,000? Instead of making the 2,100, we need to adjust our budget downward. So that what we have then, when we calculate that, we're going to wind up with direct materials. For 2,000 statues, we have a direct material rate of $12, so we have, this should cost us $24,000. For 2,000 statues with $11 direct labor, we should have $22,000. For 2,000 statues with a variable manufacturing overhead rate of $3, we should have $6,000. So the difference between the flexible and the actual is spending variance. And then the planning budget up here is what we had when we planned this. We originally planned for 2,100 statues, but a higher direct materials cost. This was coming right from the planned budget. A higher labor cost, and then a higher manufacturing overhead cost. And the differences between this and the flexible budget really are really caused by the activity variance, as we noted earlier. So when we look at standard cost variance analysis, we're going to look at a couple of ways we want to think about this. First, we want to look at a price variance, which is the difference between the actual amount paid for a unit and the standard amount we calculated. The quantity difference is variance is going to relate to the amount of direct materials we used between the standard and what we actually used. And then when it comes to direct labor, we're going to look at, okay, the standard quantity allowed which, sorry about that, I didn't mean to make the page flip, but what we're going to start with is the standard quantity allowed and the standard hours allowed. Now, the standard quantity is going to relate directly to the materials, and the rate, or the hours allowed, is going to relate to labor. So when we look at this, here's a model that we're going to use for variances, and we're going to calculate the actual quantity of input in actual price is going to be the actual quantity times actual price. The actual quantity of input at standard price will be actual quantity times standard price. And then the standard quantity allowed for actual output at standard price is going to be standard quantity times standard price. This is going to be looking at a variance model very similar to what we were looking at earlier for the flexible budget. So what we're doing is we're saying, okay, if we take number one, actual quantity times actual price, minus number two, actual quantity times standard price, what we have is a price variance because we're looking at the effect of this change from the standard price to the actual price. When we take the actual quantity times standard price and subtract standard quantity. So again, when we look at the actual quantity of the input at the standard price and subtract out the standard quantity times the standard price, the difference that we're going to get is the difference between standard quantity and actual quantity, which is a quantity variance. So we have a third kind of variance that we can have when we take the actual quantity of input at actual price and subtract out the standard quantity at the standard price. And that will give us a spending variance. And basically the spending variance is going to be related to the difference between what our standard is and the actual in both quantity and amount or rate. So that really is the basis for what we're talking about when we look at the variances. Now, when we get to a standard quantity that's allowed, and we're looking at what we think we should be able to utilize to make these products, we're going to have this formula to calculate that. We're going to take the actual output times the standard quantity per unit, which will be established by some form of calculation or understanding or a study or something of that nature. Now, when we look at cost analysis for direct materials, here's an example. We'll take, here we had the standard quantity. I'm going to go over here and start with standard quantity. Standard quantity of 6,000 pounds, which is what we would need in order to make the produced output. So we have 2,000 units times 3 pounds per unit, 6,000 pounds. So that's the standard. Times the standard rate or price is $4 a pound. So we get a standard cost for this production of $24,000. The actual quantity of input at the standard price then is what we actually use. So instead of 6,000, we use 6,500 pounds at the standard price of $4 per pound. So we wound up with $26,000 in cost, in total cost. But this difference between the actual quantity of input, number 2, and number 3, is the materials quantity variance because the standard price is used in both. The only thing that changes is the quantity. Likewise, when we look at this particular difference, we're looking at the difference between actual quantity times standard price and actual quantity times actual price. So we go with the actual quantity that we had over here, and then we have a price difference. So we have the actual price of $3.80 a pound versus $4 a pound over here. The difference between these two then is going to be the materials price variance. So we're looking at price here and quantity here. Now, if we take the actual quantity times actual price and compare that to the standard quantity times standard price, what we wind up with is a spending variance, and that difference here is shown as an unfavorable variance. So those are the variances we're looking at for materials and quantity. And there's a lot of information here to explain what that means and how you would do that. But here are, in Exhibit 10.5, the equations that you would use to identify different variances. Now, using the formulas we were above, we would take actual quantity times actual price minus actual quantity times standard price. We could rewrite that as actual quantity times actual price minus standard price. That gives us a standard price variance. Likewise, when we're looking at quantity, we can rewrite that equation that we were looking at above, where we took actual quantity times standard price minus standard quantity times standard price. Rewrite it as standard price times actual quantity minus standard quantity. And we get a materials quantity variance that computes out to be $2,000 unfavorable. The price variance is $1,300, and that's favorable. So when we look at direct labor variances, we're going to do the same thing, except we're going to use hours and the rate that we're paying for the hours of labor. So we start with actual hours of input at the actual rate here, which is what we actually used. It's what we actually paid out in labor costs, direct labor costs. And then we compare it with, then over here we have the standard hours and the standard rate. And this is what we said should be the standard for this particular product. So we wind up with $22,000 here. And when we compare the standard hours times the standard rate with the actual hours times the standard rate, we get a labor efficiency variance. Instead of labeling it like a quantity variance, what we're going to think of it as is that we use less labor hours than what we planned, and so there's a variance that's we use more hours than planned. The actual hours were more than planned, so there's an unfavorable labor variance. If we use less hours than what we planned, that would be favorable. Here we have the same hours in the equation, but we're comparing a different labor rate that we're going to calculate. So we have the actual hours times the actual rate, and subtract out the actual hours times the standard rate, and we're going to get a difference here between these two numbers of $420. And because the actual is less than the standard, we're going to have a $420 favorable labor rate variance. And again, if we look at the total actual cost, actual hours times actual rate, subtract out standard hours times standard rate, we wind up with a spending variance of $680, and that's unfavorable because it's more than what we said the standard should be. Okay, so those are both the labor efficiency variance and the labor rate variance. And that's what's going to go in to make the difference between, or basically be our analysis of direct labor costs. You can see here we rewrite the equation in the same way for the labor rate variance. Instead of making two equations here, we say actual hours times the actual rate minus the standard rate. It gives us a favorable variance. The standard hours then for labor efficiency times actual hours minus standard hours, and that gives us the labor efficiency variance. So those are the variances we want to talk about there. Now here's an example of what we do when we're looking at variable manufacturing overhead, and we're looking at the cost variances here. So we have again, what we're doing is we're basing variable overhead on the hours of direct labor. That was our standard, our company-wide standard. So we start over here with the standard hours times the standard overhead rate to get what we believe would be the standard for variable overhead. Here we take the actual hours times the standard rate, and that gives us basically this amount here based on the actual hours, but still it's times the standard rate. And this difference then will be the variable overhead efficiency, which means if we used less hours than what we planned, we're going to have a favorable efficiency variance, but if we used more, it'll be unfavorable like it is here. Then we take the difference between the actual hours of input times the standard rate and the actual hours times the actual rate of input, the actual overhead rate. And so we're going to just take the same hours but use the actual overhead rate that resulted from what we actually incurred. So here we have a difference between these two that we're going to call the variable overhead rate variance. And then again, the difference between the actual and the standard without considering any of the intermediate variances is going to be a spending variance. So that's how we would calculate variable overhead rates. And here the formulas are rewritten again. So in my mind, the most important part in this chapter is really knowing what these formulas mean and what the variances are that they calculate. So we have the variable overhead rate variance, which is going to be the actual hours, and then in parentheses, the actual rate minus the standard rate. The variable overhead efficiency variance is going to be the standard rate times the actual hours minus the standard hours. So we're going to isolate the variance as either related to the rate difference or related to the hours that we actually utilized. So basically that's it for Chapter 10, and I just want to let you know what those variances are and how to compute them. You will need this information in the Excel project, so I will be making another video very shortly, and you will see it appear here as well.